First Corinthians chapter 13. And while you're going there or finding that in your Bible, it should automatically open up already to First Corinthians. I want to make this special invitation to all of you for Friday night service. It's our Good Friday service. We do this annually, and we do it together with our Spanish congregation. So if you're not doing anything on Friday, or if you are, instead come here and worship God together. We're going to be going through the sacrifice of the perfect lamb, and we will do it bilingually. So we're together with our Spanish church, English and Spanish simultaneously. It's difficult, but we only do it once a year. But we would love for you to be here with us, joining together with our Spanish church. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we continue in our study between verses 4 through 7, and now specifically in verse 5, where we begin to see after rudeness and after selfishness, as we heard about last week, love is also, at the very end of this verse, described as not irritable or angry or easily provoked, some translations have. This concept of anger and irritableness is something we are all aware of. We all know that anger, especially when it's untamed, is a destructive emotion and feeling. It is turbulent and violent affection, if not bridled and restrained, can cause tremendous harm, not only in your own health, but in the lives of those in which it is projected towards. Some interesting research recently has come about in 2025 and 2026 from scientific journals and medical journals, which give a meta-analysis to confirm that anger is less about the trigger and more about how the mind processes it or regulates it. Remember, the scientific world distinguishes itself or separates itself rather pridefully from the Bible or any notion of the Bible, but in most occasions their conclusions or hypotheses affirm what the Bible teaches. Large 2025 meta-analysis found the scientific article in Nature magazine and the research from the National Library of Medicine found that anger is positively linked to rumination, or this cycle of repetitive negative thinking in oneself, avoidance and suppression, and negatively linked to the acceptance of cognitive reprisal. Another 2025 systematic review with 250,000 participants shows poor emotion regulation strongly predicts aggression and reactive anger. Basically what this means, that anger persists not because of the event itself, but because of the mental loops, replaying, justifying, and suppressing our attitude. What does that mean again? Anger comes from constantly replaying the event, and it builds and builds and builds within, especially when it is justified on your behalf and suppressed. Other studies connect it more to our health. Anger can impair blood vessels, which lead to cardiovascular strain. Chronic suppression is also harmful because it is linked to stress, anxiety, and cardiovascular disease. Key tension in this research shows that it leads to explosive anger, which equates to harmful attitudes and harmful character. Suppressed anger is also extremely harmful to yourself and to others, which is, for most of us, pretty logical, correct? This is kind of what we see every day, and yet medical research is straining itself to figure out why anger is such an issue. The neuroscience is showing that anger lingers in brain studies from Stanford that demonstrate the emotional state that can persist long after the trigger due to sustained neural activity, which means you want to remember the cause of your anger, which makes you angry, and it makes you feel good to be angry because of what someone else did to you. Anger, as most of these studies come to a conclusion, is not just a feeling, it becomes a reinforced neural pattern, constant replaying in your brain. So the goal here for most scientists is, their conclusion to all of this is, regulate your anger, regulate your explosions, and regulate the need to express this consistently, but you don't have to eliminate it. So that's their answer for all of this study, all of these studies in the last 2 years of anger. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, in the context of the church, love is not angry. Love, as the technical term in English says, is not irritable. This is something that we all have to deal with. I think most of us here know people who are always angry. We have nicknames, right? Hothead. We see this on the 290 expressway on Monday mornings on our way to work. Even within ourselves, waiting in long lines, anywhere. Anger is part of life, and it's part of our reaction and our feeling. But is it sinful? Is it part of our natural makeup, which scientists say, hey, just suppress it. Just bring it down a notch. Just stop thinking about it. Stop thinking of what makes you angry. Is it that simple? Well, what we're going to see here is that Paul is not simply calling the Corinthian church to, hey, just don't be mad. Don't be mad. Be happy. Be happy and sing the song of happiness in your life. It's not just a simple call to happiness. Instead of having a long face, have a smile on your face. Turn that frown upside down. It's not just that. For Paul, as he knows what anger can do within a community of Christians, as he has seen play out, Paul takes everything he knows from Scripture and puts it into this one word and calls the church to avoid anger because it is highly destructive within the community. What does Paul know? Well, as we studied Paul from the very beginning of his life in 1 Corinthians, we know Paul is an erudite or a scholar per se in the Jewish tradition. He knows what Jewish scripture says. He knows the Torah. He knows all of the Old Testament. This is part of his makeup as a young man being trained by the Pharisee Gamaliel. He knows what the Old Testament says, and throughout the entire Old Testament, anger is equated with an evil attitude. There's some parts where anger is seen positively, which we'll see, but Paul knows that anger is depicted with the word af in the Hebrew. And af is an interesting word because af describes the nostrils or the nose. And so therefore, the nose becomes the organ or symbol of anger in the Old Testament. Can you imagine why? Have you ever seen someone angry? What flares up? Their nose, right? Their nose gets red and it flares, and their nostrils, they begin to breathe harder. And when you're in an argument and when you're about to fight and when people get you angry, it's evident by your facial expression. Anger is therefore the most easily noticeable emotion that one can carry. It's difficult to hide your anger. That's why when people ask you, what's wrong? And you say nothing, they're asking you because they can see it in your nostrils. They see it in your face that you're visibly upset. And you know that you're portraying yourself in that way. You can be angry at a party. You can be angry at an event that you didn't want to go to, but they made you go to. Remember when my wife would drag me to baby showers, and I was like, I'm a man. I do not belong in a baby shower. And I would be visibly upset when I was there, when they're playing these baby games and, feeding the bottle to the man. And that would drive me nuts. And so therefore, never invite me to your baby shower. I probably will not go. That should stick to the women side of things. But anyways, it's visible. It's in your facial expression. And there's different types of anger that we'll see. Anger, for example, and what Paul knows about anger is that it was created, hear this, created by God. You say, wait, aren't we talking about the negative aspects of anger? Well, remember that all human expression, all human feeling was created by God. At the end of all his creation in Genesis chapter 1, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. This was part of the natural sense of man. And in that, it was good prior to the fall. Anger and wrath are often attributed to God himself in the Old Testament. Everything about God is just and holy, and yet God is angry and wrathful. Romans chapter 1 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." In John chapter 3, verse 36, "Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him." Even Jesus, in Mark chapter 3, verse 5, he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and he was restored. But what's interesting in all these cases, Peter notes in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, that Jesus committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. So therefore, anger equated to God and to the righteousness of Jesus is allowed when it is against evil, against unrighteousness, when it refrains you from sinning, as we'll see. Paul will later say in Ephesians chapter 4, "Be angry and what? Do not sin." Anger is therefore an emotion that was built in us from the very beginning, but has been stained by sin, has been contaminated by sin. And therefore our anger, now more often than none, it demonstrates our fallen nature. And that's why anger becomes so devastating and so harmful to people. And it is so harmful even within marriage when this begins to lash out. Unrighteous anger is that which is contradictory to the nature of God, to the nature of Christ, and therefore should not be part of our makeup. Which is why Paul says, love is not irritable. It is not angry. Anger in the Old Testament is forbidden in the 6th commandment under murder. Thou shalt not murder. Why do people kill? Why is this war going on in the Middle East? People hate each other. They hate each other. This is what happens if you know the stories that go around. My wife loves to watch these murder shows about women that I think they're called murderous women or whatever. And there are these shows that these women get so angry with their husbands that they end up murdering them and killing them. It becomes a rage within themselves and anyone that leads to murder, which is why it's condemned within the law of God. Remember the first 2 commandments? Love God, love your neighbor. These are the commandments that Jesus condenses all of the law into by having an extreme love for God and therefore having an extreme love for your neighbor, and not falling into a bitter hatred, which will lead to, in most cases, murder. Here's a sad verse, and here's a story I want to focus on a little bit before we get into the context of 1 Corinthians. As a matter of fact, turn with me to 2 Samuel. Turn there. Here's a devastating story. In 2 Samuel chapter 13. Well, as a matter of fact, let's give it some context before we get there. Go to chapter 11. And you'll be reminded in chapter 11, the very first verse, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. We all know the sad story of King David when he's sending all the people to war. During the time of war, David stays back and he falls in love, or he has lustful eyes for Bathsheba, ends up murdering her husband, ends up sleeping with Bathsheba, committing adultery. And then in chapter 12, the prophet Nathan rebukes David and tells him that the sword will never leave his home, which is God's judgment over David. But now we're in chapter 13, and there's a sad verse. If you go all the way down to, there's a lot of sad verses in this chapter. One of the ones that I want to focus on at the beginning is verse 22. But Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad. Stop right there. Pause. Absalom and Amnon are brothers. Brothers from literal different mothers, as we'll see. Absalom's mom was different from Amnon's mom, but they had the same father in King David. And when we read here, Absalom spoke to Amnon, neither good nor bad. This is basically a Hebrew idiom, which means Absalom did not speak to his brother. He didn't have a relationship with him. He didn't interact with his brother. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where there is a difficulty in the family, and whatever the cause may be, you end up simply avoiding and not talking to your own family member. So immediately here we have a sad state of affairs within the kingly family. Brothers that do not speak with each other, and brothers that will harbor hatred towards one another. So if you keep going in the verse, it gets even more sad. For Absalom, what does it say? Hated Amnon. Why did he hate him? Because he had violated his sister Tamar. So here we have an extremely sad verse of a family in conflict, of bitterness, of brothers not speaking with one another. And not only that, there's hatred in here, but not only that, there is an abusive relationship with one brother towards his half-sister. Amnon rapes his sister Tamar in chapter 13. And this builds an unresolved anger in the life of Absalom. Here's another sad verse here. Well, let's go from the very beginning so you could kind of see this in chapter 13, verse 1. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. So here we have a passion that is not allowed in by the laws of God. We know in Leviticus, as we studied several weeks ago, that incest was not allowed in the law of God. And Amnon could not control himself. He saw how beautiful his half-sister was, and this disgusting sin led him to live a life of overindulgent passion that ultimately led him to hate his sister by violating her and raping her. See, it's an interesting use of words here. In verse 1, Amnon loved Tamar, but would you do to someone such an ill and profound level of evil to someone you love? And so what we have here in between verses 14 to 15, he would not listen to her, it said, when she tried to stop him. And being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. And what did love turn into? In verse 15, then Amnon, what? Hated her with a very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. See how many times the word hate was there? He hated her with a very great hatred. It's another Hebrew idiom, emphasis on hatred, from this built-up anger that Amnon had within himself. But then look at another sad verse. Verse 21. When King David heard of all these things, he was very, what? Angry. It's a sad verse because it only tells us the emotional state of King David. He was angry, but he did nothing. Did nothing. Absalom was probably waiting for his father to bring justice over his sister. You know, it's incredible if you read the story of Absalom. His mother, Maacah, and his sister Tamar, after all of this occurs, he names his own daughters Maacah and Tamar. Like, he loved his mother and he loved his sister so much, and it's reflected in his own family tree. He named them after them. And so this offense towards his sister was a profound, devastating attack on the life of Absalom. And he looks to his father, and the only thing we see his father do is become very angry. And then the very next verse, there's nothing else that King David did. Rather, it shows us the reaction. Absalom, in verse 22, spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he violated his sister. Because his father did nothing, it built within his own brother, his own son, hatred towards his brother. And partly, King David did nothing because of what we read earlier in chapter 11 and chapter 12. He was in his own guilt. Who am I to judge my own son after I did almost the exact same thing to Uriah? Absalom now hates his brother, does not talk to him. How long does he not talk to his brother? Look at verse 23. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shears at Baal-hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. So this is the beginning of a plot. After 2 full years, he avoids his father, and he avoids his brother. So here the bitterness has built to such a degree that after 2 years, this is what anger does, right? It doesn't, when you don't stop anger, when the Lord doesn't take over your life in this anger, what does it do? It builds within you so much hate that you eventually plot out how to release that anger. You know, it's never good to suppress it. This is what we read earlier in the medical research, right? You should not suppress your anger. It'll cause harm to yourself. But ultimately, it will lead you to make decisions that you're not comfortable with or that you would not normally do. And after 2 years, can you imagine not talking to this person, not talking to the brother? You know he's your brother. You know where he lives. You know he's part of the kingdom. You know, and in this case, that he's next in line to the throne because this is the first heir of the kingdom after his father. And you know that he's next in line. So your bitterness is growing even more for Absalom. This is what happens when you allow hate and bitterness to take control of your life and you don't do anything about it. Instead, you hide and you suppress it. And this is what we see in many marriages. It's incredible to see this in the family dynamic where either the wife just shuts up, says nothing for 3-4 years, or the husband just takes it, a passive man, and he just takes all the abuse, and he stores it up, and it literally begins to kill him physically. And all of this is just becoming built up until it leads to such a devastating effect on the person who brought the offense. He plots to kill his brother. Look at verse 28. Absalom in verse 28. After he invites everybody over to his house, Absalom commanded his servants, "Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant." So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. So sad. What happened? This anger that led to hatred, after 2 years, finally was expressed. And it was not a simple, hey, maybe today I'll do harm against my brother. This was on Absalom's mind for 2 years. Building until that time came to release. And he brings him to his house, has his servants kill him, and the word gets to David, and David is devastated. All 3 men here sinned before the Lord. Amnon's sin is pretty obvious. Violates his half-sister and then hates her. David's sin is pretty obvious by being a passive father and not bringing correction in his own home. And Absalom's sin is pretty obvious because he allowed it to take control of his life and lead to murder. This all pertains to what most of us have often felt in our own lives. If we're truthful, we've all lashed out at one point or another. And often than none, we lash out to the people we love the most. There's hatred that builds and anger that builds within us. And it leads us to sin by exploding with the person that we love the most. It happens with our kids. It happens with our wives and husbands. It happens with our father. It happens with our mother. There's so much stories that we can say of sons that hate their father, of sons that hate their mother, and have lived their entire lives hating their parents and have grown bitter and cold to any type of relationship because it's consumed their lives. Keeps replaying in their brain. It's their fault. It's their fault. It's their fault. It's their fault that I'm like this. And all it does is build up the anger that's within that will lead you to sin and have devastating effects on those that harmed you. What does the Bible say about all this? What does Paul know about this? You can be You can rest assured that Paul knew the life of David, as he himself mentions him in his letters of having a heart after God. You know the reason that Paul mentions anger in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and he mentions this in Colossians, and he mentions this in the list of vices in Galatians chapter 5. This is all for Paul a detrimental emotion for the life of the church. The word Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, now if you go back to 1 Corinthians, is the passive verb parexenetai. This word of irritable or anger has the connotation for Paul that talks about a state of inward arousal. You know, something that begins to burn up inside, urge, stimulate, being provoked to wrath, irritate, being irritable. All of this inward expression and emotion and feeling that begins to build and bubble like a volcano. This is what Paul means by anger. When you're like that, how do you act with other people? It's like when people know that you're angry, they tell the people on the other side, hey, no, don't talk to Johnny right now. No, just avoid him. Leave him alone. Let him sit in the corner. Don't even look his way. It happens a lot at work, right? When your manager, your supervisor, the owner of the company is angry. And everybody's like, just don't even look at him. There's a show that I'm watching with my wife, and the owner of a company, I think the show is, I forgot the name of the show, but one of the main characters is Calvin Klein, the designer. And his wife tells him, you're like a thermostat. Your attitude here is like a thermostat. People know when you're upset. And so you could tell how the weather is within the building. People know when you're angry. It's visible because it's building up inside of you, ready to lash out on those or on the thing that brings you to that state of arousal. But for Paul, what is he saying? Love is not easily angered. Love is not easily annoyed or provoked to anger. Love is a stranger to bitterness, which is why Paul mentions this in Corinthians. Anger is often reactive. It's a feeling of reactive to life circumstances, which is why people become angry with others, because they can shift the blame on them instead of owning up to their own decisions. Right? We said that. It's their fault. It's the shift game. It's the blame game. It's wanting to feel good about yourself because you're angry because of what someone else did to you. It's this reparation mentality. I need you to give me back what is rightfully mine, even if you yourself didn't do it. It's reactive. It reacts to the evil of other people. And within the Corinthian church, we have seen the evil that exists in the Corinthian church. We simply could go back to verse 4, and we know that the evil in the Corinthian church is based off their lack of kindness, their lack of patience, their envy, their boastfulness, their arrogance, their rudeness, their selfishness. All of this is the evil that exists within the Corinthian church, and so the natural reaction to evil is evil, right? For the natural man. This is why we spoke off earlier at the beginning that kindness is also reactive. But you're kind, you react with benevolence when you are treated with evil. In this case, when you are treated with evil, people that are unrestrained in their anger, when they receive evil done to them, they will lash out with evil. Oh, you do that to me? Guess what? I'm going to do it to you. And 10 times worse. It's reactive. You treat others how they treat you, and often becomes worse, because if you do not tame your anger, it simply builds up. Oh, one day, watch. One day, you'll pay me back. You did this to me today? Just wait. Tomorrow, next week, next year, 10 years from now, I'm not going to forget. I will pay you back. And people wait for that moment. And they allow their anger to build up so that they can feel so good when they finally release that anger. Paul says, get angry, but don't sin. Ultimately, for Paul, the problem with anger is that it's prideful. It's a reactive emotion because the people or the circumstances in your life do not satisfy your every need. Instead, Paul is trying to get the church, like kindness, as a choice to how to react to the evil in other people, which is for Paul, love. Not anger, love. Show them love. When people treat you like dirt, when people walk over you, when people slap you around, when people don't mind anything about you, give them love, not anger. Look at what James says. If you go there to the book of James, I love this. This is a famous verse that we've read. James chapter 1. I love this. Simple and profound. James chapter 1, verse 19. Know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Now, I want you to try that the next time you're in an argument with your spouse. The next time you're in an argument with your parents. The next time you're in an argument with your kids. The next time you're in an argument with your friends. Be slow to speak and slow to anger. And instead, just listen. Can you imagine what that would cause? Can you imagine how much angrier the other person would get? Why aren't you saying anything? Why are you did it and you don't say nothing? Why? What's the reason? Look at verse 20. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And everything in your will is like, let me tell you what you need to hear, right? Everything inside of you is like, let me smack you back the right way just so you understand how wrong you are. And James, like Paul, is saying that is not the righteousness of God. That is not what Christ would do. That is not part of your spiritual DNA. That is contrary to who you're supposed to be. So in that case, it becomes evident that the Corinthian church is therefore suffering of bitterness, rivalries, quarrel, strife, anger, and hatred towards one another. The church without kindness, a church without patience, a church that has plenty of pride, envy, selfishness, and arrogance will lack the self-restraint and be vengeful, angry people. This is why the verb is placed in the passive voice here in the context of 1 Corinthians. It is not easily provoked to anger by others. It's a passive verb, right? This anger is caused by somebody else over you. And Paul's saying, do not be provoked to anger. The church in Corinth was not only divided, as we've seen time and time again through Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians, but as we mentioned earlier, in the very chapter 1, their division has come not only because of their prideful arrogance, but because there's quarreling among them. This is what Paul says. I've heard from Chloe that there is quarreling among you brothers. What is this word quarreling? Bitter argumentation and fight, and often physical fights come to the surface in this word. Imagine a church that is fighting with one another, like physically. Imagine you go to church and people are like lashing out at each other, and you're like, where am I? I thought we were gonna like do the Jesus thing. I thought we were gonna like sing a couple songs, but it's evident that people here hate each other. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 20, for I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, that perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. This is what Paul fears in his second letter of Corinthians. Like the problem is not getting fixed. He's afraid that he's going to show up again, and all of this anger is going to be demonstrated in their hostility, slander, and gossip, and conceit, and disorder. So one of the things that we have to equate gossip with is with anger. You're angry with someone, you will end up gossiping about them. This is why if we eliminate anger, perhaps there will be less gossip in church. But we're people, right? We get angry. And we like it. For Paul, anger that leads to quarrels are actions of the flesh. This is what the people of the world do. According to Paul in Galatians chapter 5, that chapter that I mentioned of the fruits of the Spirit. In Galatians chapter 5, now the works of the flesh are evident, he says in verse 19. Then he mentions in verse 20, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions. What are all these? These are all parts of the flesh, of acting like the world, unregenerate, people that don't know Christ, people that don't know God, people that don't know love. This is what they do. For Paul, that would be, in a more profound sense, the actions of animals. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 15, he says this, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. He uses the language of animalistic characteristics. You're animals. Don't bite each other. Don't come after each other with an animal instinct to tear each other apart. This is part of the work of the flesh. This is why he says earlier in chapter 5, verse 13, you were called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, what does he say? Serve one another. Oh my goodness. Everything is wrapped up in this love-service relationship. But Jonathan, Pastor Jonathan, you don't understand what he did to me. Can you imagine Absalom? You imagine the righteous anger of Absalom for that moment. This guy raped my sister. I have every right to be angry. And one would say, yes, you have every right to be angry. But do not be angry enough to sin. For God says, vengeance is mine. God will deal with Amnon as he dealt with David. But that's the problem, right? It's not equally as satisfying. You look at God and you're like, oh God, but do it now. Bring your vengeance today. I want to see this on the news. I want to see this on his Instagram feed. I want to see this on his Facebook post. I want to see this everywhere, how devastated he is, God. Do it and do it now. I want vengeance and I want it now. Because we often think, God's going to forget, God's not going to do it, and that's going to drive me nuts because he's going to continue to prosper, she's going to continue to prosper, like nothing happened. God says, hey, vengeance is mine. You don't need to worry about this. And this is what happens in the notion of the church life. It's just that you don't know what this person has done, and then that kind of gives you an allowance in life to live your life with bitterness and anger. It's because you don't know my parents. It's because you don't know what they did to me. It's because they abandoned me when I was a kid. It's because you don't know the type of home I grew up in. And all of this becomes to build your character in a way of it's their fault and not yours. And it feels good to have that resentment and bitterness towards them because it shifts the blame from you to them, which allows you to live a little bit more freely, but you're still a slave to your emotion. This is an area that the Bible clearly brings up as problematic. We don't have time today to go through all the verses that I wanted to list with you about anger and how the Bible presents it. I think we have a good understanding up until now, and I want to continue this the following week after next week is Easter Sunday. But I want to continue this in the following week because this is an area that we must bring to submission under God. And I want to provide to you some helpful resources from Scripture itself on how to tame anger. Because this is never a good thing in our lives, friends. Which is why Paul is calling the Corinthian church to not be angry. And we'll pray today that God begins to heal that heart that has harbored hatred for so long so that you could finally release it and say, God, you are just, you are sovereign, you are powerful, and I trust that you will do the work. Me, I'm going to continue to love and serve and pray and move on because God ultimately will bring justice over unrighteousness. Let's stand this morning, church.